I'm now the Jane Austen summer program instead of myself on the chat.
So was I.
Zara,
we're all the Jane Austen summer program.
Did you say history and comparative literature at UNC?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
We are live.
We are live. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a moment for everyone to join us on the stream. But in the meantime, we see that we already have a pretty vibrant chat going on. So please let us know where you're watching from. We would all love to hear it. I'll start off. I'm in Northern Virginia.
North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Mississippi.
And I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, although part of my heart is always in Chapel Hill, I will say.
We have people spread around the country as usual, and from Dublin and other places.
And Poland.
There's our friend from Poland. Hi, Maromiros. And Canada, excellent.
All right, well, let us begin. Welcome back, everyone, to yet another wonderful talk from Jane Austen and Company. As always, I'm Anne Ferdig, and I am the co-director for Jane Austen and Company. Joining me here tonight are my wonderful co-hosts, Dr. Inga Brody and Dr. Susan Ford, as well as our amazing technical director, Malika Amoruso.
And tonight we welcome Dr. Zara Anishanslin to talk about Portrait of a Woman in Silk, London designer Anna Maria Garthwaite.
Yes, it's my pleasure to welcome Zara Anishanslin. Professor Anishanslin is Associate Professor of History and Art History at the University of Delaware. She specializes in early American and Atlantic world history with a focus on 18th century material culture. Anishanslin received her BA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in history and comparative literature. And her PhD in the history of American civilization at the University of Delaware in 2009, where her dissertation won the prize for Best Dissertation in the Humanities. And then in 2011, it also won the University of Pennsylvania's Zuckerman National Prize in American Studies. She's been a Barra Sabbatical Postdoctoral Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at the New York Historical Society, and the Patrick Henry Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. In 2018-2019, Zara was the Mount Vernon Fellow at the Georgian Papers Program of King's College University of London and the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. She also served as material culture consultant for Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, the exhibition, in 2018-2019. Her book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, was published by the Yale University Press in 2016. It was winner of the biennial Best Book Award by the Library Company of Philadelphia. And she's working on her next book, London Patriots, Transatlantic Politics, Material Culture, and the American Revolution.
And I just want to give a plug out there for everyone for Zara's book, which is this talk is drawn from. I know a lot of J-Nites out there are very fond of material culture, fashion, history, and textiles, and this is a really wonderful exploration of the textile from its design by this amazing woman we're going to hear about tonight, all the way to the women who wore it, to the people who painted it. So highly recommend that you pick up a copy. And now we'll hand things over to Malika to explain the Q&A.
Hi everyone, welcome to YouTube, our new streaming platform. If you'd like to leave a comment or question, please use the comment feature in the sidebar or submit your questions to our email address, info@janeaustenandco.org. Those questions will then be asked by us in the chat for you if you don't have a Google account. So if you don't have an account, please don't be afraid to send your questions into our email and we'll ask them for you. And that email is at the bottom of your screen.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so just so you know, tonight's event is recorded and will be available using the same link you used to get here after the talk. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Zara Anishanslin.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this. I am one of those people who loves all things Jane Austen, so delighted to be part of the co in Jane Austen and Co, if only for the night. And as was mentioned, I did do my undergraduate work at UNC Chapel Hill, so this gives me an excuse to have some nostalgia in a very positive way. I'm looking forward to everyone's comments and questions, and I have timed my talk, so there should be time for questions at the end. I will also say I'm, a public-facing scholar, so if questions arise or if you'd like to be in touch after the talk, you can find me through the University of Delaware's History Department website and email me. I'd be glad to be in touch. So if you find your way to the corner of London's Victoria and Albert Museum, devoted to the 18th century English silk industry, and peer way down near the bottom of one of the cases, you'll find the treasure you see on the screen here. This landscape, elaborate though it is really small, only about a foot by slightly over a foot large. And it's made entirely of tiny slivers of cut paper, brown painted black, and then feathered onto white vellum. Note the many species of trees, including an exotic palm tree on the left, middle, and gardeners hard at work shaping the landscape. This piece is a memorial to the patience and skill of the teenage daughter of a local clergyman who made it in Lincolnshire in the year 1707. This girl was well educated and genteel, not unlike an Austen heroine actually, and cut work, as this was called, was a common hobby among girls of her class. But this particular cut work piece is unusual because of who made it. Anna Maria Garthwaite, who grew up to become one of early modern Britain's few women silk designers. And almost 40 years later, we see her skill further memorialized across the Atlantic when Philadelphian Anne Shippen Willing sat for her 1746 portrait wearing silk that Garthwaite designed in London 3 years before. And here you'll see the image on the left of the original design that became transformed into the silk on the right. So these two women, the designer and the portrait subject, were the sort of literate, economically secure women who should have left documentation behind, but neither left much of an archival trail. Oh dear, I don't know why. Oh, thank you. No diaries or huge caches of letters, but we can start to reconstruct them through things that they made and owned. And they serve as a reminder that objects tell us things we miss in documents alone, even when we're talking about literate people. And particularly perhaps when we're talking about women who, even if literate, are so often lost in traditional archival sources. And the thing that brings their otherwise separate stories together across the Atlantic, silk, offers an unusually rich chance to consider women as both makers and buyers, and as technical geniuses as well as fashionistas. And in doing so, we better understand how women shaped global trade and participated in global scientific networks. So by looking at both the woman who designed this silk and women who wore the fruits of her labor across the Atlantic, we can explore full biographies of a thing like flowered silk. And one benefit of this approach is that it takes us beyond considering what most people would think of as a commodity, only in its finished point, its moment of purchase. It tells us how deeply women were involved in creating and making, not just buying and wearing, objects like this dress that 18th century people used and wore on both sides of the Atlantic. And one other thing I'm going to touch on in tonight's talk is that it also, following the life story of these objects, can tell us about the often brutal reality of the labor that created the creation of such luxuries, such as the enforced work of slaves, and the reminder that silk itself is a thing of shimmering beauty made from a dead worm's spit. So the botanicals in this portrait in silk were aesthetic choices whose commercial popularity reflected their cultural, intellectual, scientific, and political importance. Around the British Empire, people wore popular goods like this, and it looks like we are on track. Thank you for the question with the slides. Popular goods like this dress and this pair of shoes that owed their existence to plants or their beauty to floral or botanical design. Men and women alike wore clothes whose flowered design motifs mimicked garden landscapes they imposed on their environment around the British Empire, as well as the goods that they displayed in their home. Women wore flowered dresses and silk shoes like these, while men wore waistcoats with floral embroidery and damask banyans, like these spectacular objects. Together, they lived in houses where flowered silk and calico covered chairs and sofas and was draped around windows. Flowers picked from their gardens decorated these same spaces, bringing their carefully landscaped gardens indoors. As one London publication noticed, quote, "Flowers are the universal taste. We not only see them in gardens, but preserved in pots and china basins in ladies' chambers. And when deprived of the originals by the cold blasts of winter, we have them copied in painting, in japanning, and in embroidery." Not surprisingly, given their universal appeal, women often posed holding flowers in portraits, like these. They also wore flowered silk, though rarely in their portraits. And here we come to an interesting point. We tend, of course, to associate women in the 18th and 19th century with flowers more so than men. But we must remember that men, especially in the 18th century, had a real thing for flowers too. And here you see another woman holding a flower, but also, importantly, a man with a tulip on display. This is Virginian John Custis. And as his book indicates, and I know you can't see what it's called, but it has the very descriptive title of On Tulips. And in case you missed the point, the tulip is also the flower with him. As his book and his flower indicates, he loved tulips. And his portrait is a reminder that not just for men, but for women too, interest in flowers was often as much scientific and intellectual as it was aesthetic. So what all these portraits reflect is the fact that in the 18th century, the scientific and the aesthetic often went hand in hand. This was particularly true when it came to the science of plants, or botany. Botanical aesthetics shaped the British Empire in ways both large and small. Plants from around Britain's empire, notably North America and the Caribbean, profoundly changed the appearance of British landscapes and gardens. As one man put it, he could walk in an English garden, yet, quote, "feel like I was walking in a North American thicket," because the trees around him were all from that place. Plants transformed English fashion too. Even the stylized Asian aesthetic of damask, such as the one in this portrait, began to feature new exotic plants like North American magnolias. And in fact, the stylized flowers on this dress pattern by Garthwaite are in fact magnolias. From the 1740s through the 1770s, English silk was at its best when it featured floral designs. And around the British Empire, people used it to send messages that went far beyond simple statements of gentility. Take, for example, this absolute showstopper of a dress. This dress was worn in the early 1750s to celebrations in honor of the newly elected Lord Mayor of London. This was a court dress meant for the most formal of events, and yes, it is just as broad as it appears. Yards and yards and yards of silk decorated with woven flowers and botanicals spilling out of cornucopia, sparkled with metallic thread that would have glinted in the candlelight. This dress sent a clear message about its wearer's wealth and its fashionability. But it did more than that. If you look closely, you'll notice that the design and the cornucopia are actually barley and hops. The reason for this decoration? The wearer of the dress, Anne Fanshawe, was the daughter of the newly elected Lord Mayor. And her father, the Lord Mayor, well, he made the money that got him his political power by selling beer. So in other words, to 18th century viewers, her dress might as well have said this. So to mid-18th century viewers of this dress, this silk would have sent just as immediate a symbol as that t-shirt. And in this case, it was a political message, a message about how her father made his money that got him elected to be Lord Mayor. And in no small part, the political message was sent because of its botanical decorations. And no one in the English silk design industry did botanicals better than Anna Maria Garthwaite. Along with her widowed sister, Garthwaite moved from York to Spitalfields in East End of London. And here's a map of London from about 20 years after she moved there at the end of the 1720s. Now, this was an unlikely time of life for the sisters to relocate. Both were in their early 40s. Anna Maria herself had never been married, never did marry, and her sister was a widow. But they'd inherited enough funds to live a genteel life outside the urban bustle of East London. So, as you are Austen fans, you will know Austen people of this gentility don't often just pick up and move to East London in this time period, right? And yet the two sisters did, and they were drawn to their new townhouse on what was then one of Spitalfield's newer streets by the same thing that brought so many other people into the East End of London at that time. For when the sisters moved there, it was in part so the younger of the two, Anna Maria, could launch her career as a silk designer. Now, the townhouse, which you see on the right, was where the sisters lived. And it was more than a home, though. It was also where Garthwaite designed her patterns and conducted her trade. And here it's important, the architecture and the location of the house itself, because it really tells you how she conducted business. Its architectural layout gave it a distinct advantage. Among these was the light it had as a corner house, especially in the second floor room, which you see on the left is the view out of that room looking towards Christ Church. And that was the room that served as Garthwaite's design studio, as well as the most formal parlor for the sisters and their family. Another advantage was the two doors on the building. The front door on the street that is closer to the left of the screen was one that allowed people to come into a formal stair hall, and the other on the side street opened directly into a room that was separated from the rest of the house by an internal door. In other words, the family and its visitors could come and go in private through the first door, leaving the corner ground floor free for Garthwaite's business activities. And in turn, the ground room floor allowed business callers to enter the house without interacting with the family. And this is an important point, that Garthwaite's home was also her place of work. And I think that bears noting that in the 18th century, of course, home and work were not often separate spaces for women in particular. Now, 18th century silk designers like Garthwaite were skilled, highly technically efficient laborers. They drew designs that showed the weavers, like the one on the left, what patterns of color and decoration to follow to create lengths of silk on their looms. And what you see here on this screen is Anna Maria Garthwaite's pattern for a damask on the left, and then the woven finished product by one of her favorite clients, Simon Julens, who's a Huguenot weaver, on the right. These aren't the exact same design, but I wanted to show you similar patterns. So the London silk industry made all sorts of textiles, but was most renowned for its flowered silks, named very mundanely for the fact that they had floral or botanical patterns. Flowered silks were distinctively designed and produced to order, usually no more than 4 per pattern. And they were created out of raw silk that was shipped to London from across oceans, from China, India, Turkey, and Britain's North American colonies. Though based in London, the English silk trade was, from its first moments of production, even before its finished products were shipped around the world, global by nature. So a single piece of silk could actually have silk that was partly from China, partly from India, silk that was partly from British North America and partly from Italy, for example, all jumbled up into its final threads. So it really is a commodity that is global in every sense of the word. So almost all Spitalfield's flowered silk was meant for clothing rather than interior decoration or upholstery, used to make elegant dresses for women and girls, and elaborate waistcoats for men and boys. And this was a time period in which men were not afraid to be a bit of a peacock themselves, obviously. Now, fashion depended then, as it does now, on enticing consumers with the need for novelty and variety. In the 18th century Spitalfield silk industry, it was designers like Garthwaite who created this variety. And that was because the cut of clothing for the second half of the 18th century, but in particular the 1730s through the 60s, which is her most prolific time period, the form of a garment didn't change much for men or for women. What really dated a garment as old or new was the style of the fabric that it was made from. So it'd be sort of like if Britain wore, people in Britain wore bell bottoms for 30 years, but what changed was that the fabric the bell bottoms were made of told you that they were made from 1980s fabric instead of 1960s fabric. So Garthwaite was one of the real trendsetters of what elite and middling sorts were wearing in Britain and its colonies in this time period. And that's in part because she was highly prolific. She drew hundreds of patterns, over 800 in fact, that survive. They're flowered silk designs blossoming in watercolor and pencil curves across grids of ruled paper. And those grids, by the way, each grid represents a piece of thread on the loom. So it's a highly mathematical set of designs that she created. They're not just sort of, pretty drawings of flowers. Each grid represents something mathematical that will translate to the weaver and tell the weaver exactly how to put the thread into the loom and make the final textile product. So her silks spread throughout the Atlantic world, from Scandinavia to South Carolina. Men, women, and children ate, danced, walked, and posed for portraits wearing her silks that she designed. And here's a sample of some of them. You'll see here 2 of her designs, and then a surviving dress that has been remade from 18th century fabric in the 19th century. But I think you get an idea here of how shimmering and beautiful her fabrics would have been in person. So her silks survive in museums across Europe and America, mutely shimmering testament to her long ago popularity. But let's be clear that her success was improbable. Unlike many other known silk designers in 18th century London, who tended to be of French Huguenot descent, she was English. And again, unlike many other 18th century silk designers, she was not trained as a weaver herself. But as you've likely already guessed, her distinctiveness lay most fundamentally in the simple fact that she was a woman. And although other women, and here I leave you with, as I talk a bit about the silk weaving industry, with an image of one of her silks memorialized in a portrait and the other memorialized in a museum collection. So although other women certainly worked in London's silk industry, as I'll get to in a minute, few worked as designers. And Garthwaite, in fact, is the only woman designer whose designs survive. Most women who practiced skilled trades like weaving did so because their father or husband did too. And by contrast, Garthwaite never married, and she was no weaver's daughter. Instead, her father was a Cambridge-educated Anglican minister with family connections to London's Royal Society and the English nobility. So how did this well-educated spinster daughter of a Lincolnshire minister manage, and in her 40s no less, launch a successful design career in London? How did she gain the technical expertise required to design complicated mathematical patterns? Why did she never marry? Some of these questions have no known answers, and unless a stash of previously unearthed evidence, sort of salacious diaries or papers, come to light, some of them never will. And I will say at this point, I kind of hope they don't, because my book is done and then I'd have to revise it, although maybe I could do a second edition. So records make it evident that she was not only literate, but educated and financially solvent. In other words, there's no historical reason why her trail should be so faint, archivally speaking. Yet she left little more documentation than an illiterate, impoverished woman of her time might have done. There's minimal archival material beyond her will. No letters, diary, business, or advertising records. But she did leave a rich trove of things, and they speak for her. They include her house, her surviving silks, and, as I mentioned, more than 800 labeled watercolor designs. They can be read much like a diary, and they speak in her voice. Garthwaite systematically collected her designs in carefully indexed books, and her bound volumes show evidence of another set of handwriting besides her own, making it likely that either her sister or their young ward, Mary Bacon, who was their niece by marriage, helped to label and collect her designs. So this really was an all-women endeavor operating this design business. So Garthwaite spent a lot of time studying these designs and these indexes. And we know this because sometimes she draws from them to repeat elements in other designs. She consulted them much as she used bird's eye topographical views published in design books to create the cutwork piece as a teenager, which, as I'll get to in a minute, she actually copied into her designs as well. Now, designers often copied patterns, either from looking at patterns themselves or by copying something they saw woven into silk. And Garthwaite certainly did this. She kept a collection of designs from France, which, by the way, was not legal to do, as well as other Spitalfields designers. And copying designs was actually an accepted commonplace form of training the eye and the hand. Copyright was not by any stretch of the imagination the thing it is today. And at times, clients explicitly, though, asked for new patterns rather than old ones. So having a design library to page through was a valuable business tool because it meant that she could also avoid repeating old patterns that she'd given to the same clientele. And one of the reasons that Garthwaite was able to be so prolific and create so many evocative yet singular botanical designs was that she had some really important connections to Britain's global botanical networks. Because although she made her designs in this corner townhouse in London's East End, her designs were inspired by global natural history networks and the demands of the North American colonial market, which was the English silk industry's most important market outside London. Her popular designs both mirrored the larger British cultural fascination with gardens and helped foster a craze for wearing botanical landscapes in silk around the British Empire. Her design shaped a shared visual experience throughout the empire. In the 1750s and 60s, for example, we know that women in colonial New York, in Ireland, and in England all wore dresses made of the same Garthwaite pattern, but each woven in different colors, red, yellow, and pink. So these three women never knew or met one another, but their lives materially connected by touching and wearing Garthwaite silk, like this. So, like the sites of colonization and trade of the British Empire itself, Garthwaite's silk designs were a blend of the far-flung and the everyday, of European, African, Asian, Indian, Caribbean, and North American. Although she pioneered and perfected a singular English Rococo style that relied upon naturalistic botanicals like this, many of her designs had more in common with Indian calico, Chinese damask, and even Chinese export porcelain and wallpaper than with French or English silks. Sometimes, especially in damasks like that in Feke's portrait of Anne Shippen Willing, which I've showed you before, she blended European and Asian designs. And damasks like these that you see in the portrait and in the dress on the right were always Asian inspired. The name damask itself comes from the city of Damascus in Syria, a nod to its roots in the Silk Road. But damasks were always among the most popular and requested English silks North American consumers and colonists, like the woman in the portrait on the left requested. These colonists also avidly consumed Asian and Indian textiles like Chinese silk and Indian calico and chintz, like you see here. And in fact, what's interesting is from the 1720s until the American Revolution, colonial elites bought and wore more Asian textiles than their British counterparts across the Atlantic. So in terms of textiles, colonial North Americans were actually more connected to the global aesthetic of Indian and Asian goods than Britons in Britain itself. And the reason for this highlights, I think, the importance of fashion for understanding both broader political and labor histories. And in this case, fashion is pivotal to understanding the political protests called the Calico Crises. And yes, that is crises plural. There were more than one of these things that most of us have never heard of. Calico, named for the city of Calicut in India, originated there in the 11th century. So this is a textile with a long history. In the 17th century, these bright floral textiles became popular imports in Europe. And in England, where they were first imported by the East India Company and then copied by English calico makers, they, along with chintz, and here's an example of chintz, were highly popular. They were so contagiously fashionable that one of their biggest critics, the writer Daniel Defoe, likened them to the plague. Critics like Defoe claimed that calico and chintz and the women who bought them were destroying the British wool and silk industries. And weavers of wool and silk agreed. This was in part because, although like the silks Garthwaite designed, calico and chintz were fabrics with floral patterns, their patterns were printed onto cotton cloth, so stamped on in this case with wooden blocks, rather than woven into the structure of the fabric on a loom like wool or silk. And if women, in other words, preferred wearing these printed calicos, weavers lost business. And during the summer and fall of 1719, weavers began a street campaign against calico. Marching by the thousands from Spitalfields into the city of London, they tore calico off women's bodies. One woman testified in court that she was, quote, assaulted by a multitude of weavers who tore, cut, and pulled off my gown and petticoat by violence, threatened me with vile language, and left me naked in the fields. Now, this woman might have been luckier than she thought because some weavers actually threw acid on women wearing calico in public. Now, in response to such labor protests and a sustained PR campaign by Britain's wool and silk weaving industry, Interestingly, using Daniel Defoe as their mouthpiece, Parliament passed the Second Calico Act in 1721. And under this act, the East India Company could still import Indian calicos, but only if they planned to re-export them right away. And where they were allowed to legally re-export them was to Britain's North American and Caribbean colonies. So this meant that for 50 years before the American Revolution, American consumers had greater access to Indian textiles than consumers in Britain. So what I'd like to pause with here is that in designing botanically inspired silks that owe their aesthetic to Indian and Chinese, but particularly Indian aesthetics, Garthwaite is designing not as much for the London market, economically speaking, as she is for the North American market. So the colonial market is super important when it comes to understanding Anna Maria Garthwaite and her designs. So this is because when it came to consuming these India goods, as they were called, whether they were from India or China, Americans not only bought more of them, but they tended to buy the genuine object rather than the copycats made by the English silk industry. By the calico industry, rather. And I like to pause here and just remind people that made in China has been a thing forever in America. And one of the best examples of this is that baby George Washington was christened wrapped in a piece of Chinese silk that you can see here. So made in China, before America was even the United States, a popular thing. And for those same colonists, of course, they were people who avidly consumed Garthwaite's flowered silks. In 1743, as I mentioned, she began really tapping into this pre-existent market for American taste for Indian and Chinese silks. And she started drawing things that she just called India as her short term. Some of her designs are obviously, like this one, based on Indian designs for calico or chintz. And you can see her design on the left there and a sample of extant chintz on the right that, I think it's pretty clear that she's where she's getting her inspiration, right? So Garthwaite started designing in the 1720s, not long after the Second Calico Act mandated that most Indian and British-made calicos would leave England for America. She was born in 1688, so doing the math, her girlhood and young adulthood coincided exactly with the height of England's calico craze. In other words, she doubtless would have worn calico herself in the midst of the calico crises, and judging by her designs, she has a lot more like this one you see on the screen. She liked the look of it. She designed patterns evocative of cotton calico in their motifs and colors, an aesthetic mimicry that could be translated into silk woven on looms. Her silk designs, in other words, were a happy medium, sort of by-stepping the restrictions of the Calico Act, because they could employ silk weavers while still giving consumers the look of calico that they so loved. And it's worth noting that the designs for which she is most renowned, the naturalistic flowers on a cream background, were not unlike the overall aesthetic of calico printed on white fabric. And I think you can see here the clear visual similarities between a Garthwaite design of naturalistic flowers on the left and a skirt made out of Indian calico printed on a white background on the right. But silk designers not only imitated the aesthetic of calico like Garthwaite did, they also at times designed patterns for British calico makers. And one such designer was Peter Castiles, who was the son of an Antwerp printer who emigrated to England in 1717. Now, Castiles was the illustrator of a wildly popular book published in 1730 called 12 Months of Flowers. Now, this book featured 12 different illustrations of elaborate floral bouquets, one for each month of the year. And what it was meant to show you was which flowers were in season, at least in a hothouse, if not out in the wild, for that particular month. And it proved so popular that it helped inspire the first British copyright law that addressed pirating images as well as text, something popularly known as Hogarth's Law, because William Hogarth was one of the key architects behind it. And this might look familiar to some of you because you can actually buy reproductions of 12 Months of Flowers prints even today, which is wild if you think about it. Now, the book's preface noted that it intended its audience to be women as well as men who were gardeners or designers like Garthwaite. And over a third of the people who initially subscribed to finance it, in fact, were women. In 1734, Virginian John Custis, though, bought the book. he of tulip portrait fame, if you remember back to near the beginning of the talk. And over 20 years later, it held enough continued appeal that his son's widow reserved his copy for her own use from her late husband's estate. Now, this widow is also someone who's familiar to you. She is Martha Dandridge Custis, whose early portrait as a Custis you see here, the future wife of George Washington. And here you see the earliest picture of George and Martha together, which is not one that's widely circulated today, but at the time it was created in 1776. It was super popular, as you can tell by the fact that these are prints copied after the portraits. Revolutionary Americans were hanging these pictures on the wall, and Lady Washington does not look like the Martha Washington most people picture today, which I think is also fascinating. So another thing about Martha Washington was not only that she herself participated in this fascination with botanicals, but she herself bought Spitalfields flowered silk, and she bought a lot of it. One of the reasons we know she bought a lot of it is because one of the really amazing artifacts that survives at Mount Vernon is this piece, which is a sewing case. So those are individual little pockets, and you would put your needles into them, and you could also put threads in them. And each of those different colored fabrics comes from a different dress, remnants that were either left over from construction or repurposed, more likely left over from construction of the dress from the fabric. And you can see that all of these are different. So, you know, Martha Washington had at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and these are not the only ones, dresses made of flowered silk that, if they're not by Garthwaite herself, are so similar to her patterns that we can say they were inspired by her. So Martha Washington reminds us that women, whether as collectors of plants, financiers of botanical books, or designers and wearers of flowered silk, that these women were active participants in global botanical networks. And in traveling around the empire, fashionable commodities like silk, particularly the ones that were naturalistic and showed what actual flowers and plants looked like, also transported natural history knowledge. Anna Maria Garthwaite, for example, used her family's ties to London's scientific community to design cutting-edge botanical silks. She had 2 brothers-in-law who were members of London's Royal Society. Her relationship with her brother-in-law, who was an apothecary, a man called Vincent Bacon, was a particularly important one. Bacon was a member of the Apothecaries Guild and the Royal Society, nominated by no less a personage than Edmund Halley of Comet fame himself. Bacon and Garthwaite were close. He made her the guardian of his young daughter when he died, even though they were only related by marriage at that point. And as a member of the Apothecaries Guild, which maintained it, Bacon had access to private as well as public spaces at Chelsea Physic Garden, a map of which you see here. Chelsea Physic Garden was one of England's great botanical gardens. You can still see it today, actually. It's still alive and kicking in London, filled with exotic flowers and plants from America and Africa. Women like Garthwaite frequented the open spaces of the garden to view and sketch plants and flowers. But after concern over drunken carousing damaging plants caused the garden to keep public visitors off limits for certain spaces in the garden, like the greenhouse, where the valuable rare plants were kept, unless they were accompanied by an apothecary. This meant that most women certainly did not have access to those important spaces. But Garthwaite, through her brother-in-law, Vincent Bacon, did. So she was able to visit the greenhouse and see the newly imported hottest plants of the moment. And this is a time period when plants are hot commodities, both in terms of fashion and in terms of worth. So Garthwaite and Bacon began a mutual love affair with botanicals in the countryside of their native Lincolnshire. And here I'd like to go back to the image with which I started, the one that as a teenage girl, Garthwaite made living in a rector's house that leaves evidence of her fascination with botanicals. And this piece offers some fascinating insight into how Garthwaite dreamed up her designs and honed her craft. She wasn't apprenticed to anyone as far as we can tell. So she truly was inspired as a designer and then figured out how to make the craft work for her. You can clearly see the visual power that the figure of a tree held in her imagination, first in this cut work, and then in one of her first slightly awkward designs. This was probably an embroidery pattern rather than a woven silk pattern. And finally, in her much more sophisticated work, slightly over a decade later, in this design from 1734. And then if you see all 3 of them together, you can clearly see how massively she's developed her talent, and yet how the tree continues to hold such intellectual and aesthetic power for her. So another thing this cut work provides evidence of is her fascination with the labor behind cultivating the land, the work itself of gardening and landscaping. And in the next image, you'll see that people are at work, they're pruning trees, surveying the land, and this appreciation for what it requires to make a garden and a landscape look beautiful manifests visually in her silk design, as you'll see in the next image, with flowers that look as though they've been plucked out of the ground with their roots and tendrils trailing, about to be transplanted elsewhere. And Garthwaite often acted as though she were a gardener creating hybrid plants. She combined prosaic florals with exotic ones, showing them growing intertwined and grafted together, as you'll see in the next image, where she combines an English rose with an aloe. So despite the botanical impossibility of this flower that she creates, she took care to draw it realistically in a style that mimicked not only Indian chintz and calico, but also botanical drawings done from life studies. And you'll see here the comparison. On the right is an image of an aloe from the Royal Society of London's, it's a private collection that they commissioned for themselves so they could look at these aloes. Men in the Royal Society were fascinated with aloes. And on the left, you can see her, her silk design for an aloe pattern. And I don't think I need to tell you how similar they are, right? These brightly colored florals on a cream background. And aloes were fascinating because they had exotic African and Caribbean origins, they had medicinal properties, but they also varied in appearance. And Garthwaite accurately captured that variety of appearance because she created many different patterns that she just called simply aloe, aloe number 1, aloe number 2, etc. So viewers of the silk that you see in the next image saw something very similar. This is actually where a lot of these flowers came to London from. This is John Bartram's house in his garden in Pennsylvania. But if we go to the next one, you'll see the fruits of the collaboration between John Bartram, the Chelsea Physic Garden, and Anna Maria Garthwaite's access to it. Because one of the things that you see here is, and if you peer at the red and white spotted lily, that is something, a Turk's cap lily, that John Bartram sent to London in 1740. And here Garthwaite has put them into a design 3 years later, and they certainly weren't circulating beyond places like the Chelsea Physic Garden. So here we see this English silk really capturing a North American botanical that would have been seen as wildly exotic and fabulous, and that she's able to capitalize on her connections to the scientific community in order to do so. So what I'd like to argue here is that in gardens, like gardens in England and North America, flowered silk was actually a material embodiment of the global culture of the curious, of people, women as well as men, who were fascinated by the scientific, medicinal, as well as aesthetic and biological properties of plants and botanicals. So in other words, far from being simply a frivolous, fashionable commodity, silk could actually signify its wearer's participation in a global network of Enlightenment intellect. And we're accustomed to thinking of how men, like members of the Royal Society of London, exchanged natural history network of knowledge through plant specimens and letters, and through things like the commissioned drawings of the aloes that I showed you before. But we should remember that women on both sides of the Atlantic were involved in all those same networks. They just often did it through things like silk. And a woman's silk, like the one you see in the next image, could actually then advertise her erudite hobbies as well as her fashion sense. So here you see women could wear the aloes, they could wear the spotted lily. And the next one, you'll see one of those aloes woven into fabric. And I like to think that the same learned men who like to study aloes surely would have enjoyed the puzzle of deciding exactly which aloe they were seeing on Garthwaite's silk designs, and maybe the excuse it gave them to stare at a woman's skirts. But at the same time, more seriously, a woman wearing a dress decorated with such aloes could use her silk to interject her own knowledge of such exotic botanicals into a conversation. So Garthwaite's silk, in other words, was a wearable means of creating community through fashion, but fashion that reflected Enlightenment era scientific interest in natural history. And this was especially important for women, excluded as they were from joining groups like the Royal Society. Similarly, although it's usually discussed as a male-dominated field, as embodied in this famous image by William Hogarth of the industrious and idle apprentice who are silk weavers in Spitalfields, when we turn from women wearing silk to look at the history of women making silk, we see that women worked in every level of the silk industry, from thrower to weaver. And women were not simply workers in low-skilled jobs or alongside their weavers' husbands. They were often, like Garthwaite, independent, skilled workers with highly technical skills, whose labors were in demand by the most discerning and high-paying clientele. And focus on institutions like the Weavers' Company, which were male-dominated in their membership and entirely male in leadership, can obscure what is a very real presence of skilled women in early modern craft production, unless one goes digging deeper. And this image actually is a really good example of how you need to look outside archival sources to find women sometimes, whether it's in the objects themselves or in visuals, where they show up more often than they do in some of the written sources. As it turns out, in fact, successful master weavers who formed the leadership of the Weavers' Company, which is a powerful guild in London, responsible for the Calico Acts in part, were often apprenticed to women. That a well-trained and respected master weaver could be apprenticed to a woman reminds us of the skill that such women had in a male-dominated industry. And officially, although British women were not allowed to join the Weavers' Company unless they were the daughters of a master weaver who had no son, the Weavers' Company did, in fact, have women who served formal apprenticeships, and a few were even granted guild membership. And it was not unheard of for women to serve as masters to male weaving apprentices. And typically, apologies, my dog is barking, widows of master weavers continued to train apprentices if their husbands died before the apprentice's term of service was up. He's just showing that he's pro-woman in the 18th century. A few women, however, were themselves master weavers with membership. One such woman was a woman called Elizabeth Harris, and she was formerly apprenticed to a male master who was a French Huguenot. But decades later, she still appears in the guild records as training apprentices, and male apprentices at that. Harris was likely highly skilled enough to attract the notice of a boy's parents, not least because her master himself was highly trained and sought after. And she peaks, though, out of the archival records only because she never married, like Garthwaite. But we know that other women weavers, just like other women silk designers, certainly existed, but they disappear in the historical record. And in a lot of cases, it is because they're no longer spinsters, because they get married and their identities get subsumed beneath their husband's name in the official archival records. And if we go to the next image, we'll see, though, that although women weren't really present in the records, as I mentioned, they obviously are showing up everywhere in images. And these are some images that show women at work in the silk trades. On the left in 16th century Italy, and on the right in 16th century China. And I think this is very evocative of how women show up in these alternate sources like images and illustrations. But they're not in the archival records, so we need to really dig for them. But all this should not overemphasize the presence of women in these trades. Women like Garthwaite were still, at the end of the day, singular. And in part, this was because women in such trades were not without controversy. Women weavers, for example, could become targets of protests when work was scarce and wages were low at moments like the Calico Crisis. And women weavers found themselves the target not just of discontent, but often violence in such times. In 1769, for example, a particularly dramatic chain of events occurred based on people protesting women weavers. That year, 6 men broke into the house of pattern drawer and weaver Daniel Clark around 1 o'clock in the morning, demanding whether his wife had woven any of the silk on the loom and, quote, where the bitch his wife was, saying they would murder her directly and cut his ears off if he did not come up and show them where the work was. Despite his assertions that she'd made some in the past, but she wasn't going to make any more, the men went upstairs and cut the silk, very valuable silk, flowered silk like that Garthwaite designs, from the Clarks' looms. And according to Clark's wife, Elizabeth, it was the fact that she'd woven the silk that it was destroyed. As she noted, quote, I did the work. They were offended because it was a good piece of work too good for a woman to have had a hand in. Now, a few years later, the Clarks paid a heavier price for Elizabeth's labor than destroyed silk. Rumors flew in London that a hated master weaver, Louis Chauvet, who was extraordinarily wealthy and treated his workers really shabbily, had bribed Clark to testify against fellow weavers who cut silk. Clark, it seemed, had given over fellow weavers for money. And so one snowy day, a mob that was estimated to number about 3,000 people viciously attacked him in East London. And they stripped him, dragged him by a rope around his neck before pelting him with bricks and drowning him in a partially frozen pond. So the Clarks' tragedy, both Elizabeth and Daniel's, serves, I think, as a poignant reminder that women producers of cloth sometimes served as incendiary symbols. So it could be not just a matter of difficulty to be a woman in these trades, but it could, in this case, lead to a chain of circumstances that actually ended not just with destroyed silk, but with the murder of a man. But nevertheless, women always produced silk, and not just in London. And in the image here, you see yet another picture of women in early modern Europe, and entirely women in this case engaged in making silk. Those are the rolled up skeins of yarn there at the bottom. And the woman on the left is boiling the cocoons so they'll break apart before the moths can burst out and ruin the threads. And it's important to note that they didn't just do this in Europe, even though this illustration is from there. They did it in the North American colonial market as well. But in North America, they tended to not be weavers, not be silk designers, certainly. No one was designing silk in North America in the 18th century, but they were growing silk. They were sericulturists. And women were viewed as particularly appropriate to be sericulturists, in part because gardening and botanical studies were seen as proper scientific pursuits for women. They had this long, even legendary association with silk, as is indicated by the Chinese image you saw. There was even a story, one of many stories about the invention of silk making, that a Chinese empress was sitting under a mulberry tree contemplating the possibilities as a silkworm's cocoon had fallen into her hot tea and was unwinding in it. But raising silk was a more labor-intensive process than holding a cup of hot tea under a tree. Once hatched, larvae grew at exponential rates and had to be fed tens of thousands of times their own weight over the course of 6 weeks. All the while, they defecated constantly. Such habits of eating and defecating not only meant they required constant feeding, it meant their spaces required constant cleaning of fecal matter, or they would sicken and die. After about 6 weeks, they attached to surfaces, such as wooden frames, to spin their cocoons by excreting filament from their salivary glands. I told you silk was the product of a dead worm spit. But to prevent the threads from breaking, people had to do what you see that woman there. They had to steam or boil to kill the worms before their metamorphosis was complete. And it needs thousands of worms for a single pound of raw silk to be made. So about 2,500 cocoons to make a single pound. So silk making is tough, but it obviously appealed to people for its profitable possibilities, but it also appealed to people for intellectual reasons, particularly women interested in botany and the study of insects. To those fascinated by the mysteries of the natural world, mulberry-eating silkworms and their products were absolutely marvelous. And in the next image, I think you see how people were so fond of studying silkworms and their mystical properties that they anthropomorphized them at times, as in this little guy who shows up in a silkworm treatise. So as much as the profit to be had, silkworm's cycle of life and its unlikely product, salivary secretions could be woven into luxurious, lustrous fabric, inspired 18th century fascination with making silk. And especially in the British and French empires, some of the 18th century's finest thinkers, like the man you see on the next image, who you will certainly be familiar with, Benjamin Franklin, corresponded about sericulture, planted mulberry trees, obsessively observed silkworms, and wrote books about them, like the one you see in the next image. They read papers about them in meetings of London's Royal Society and Philadelphia's American Philosophical Society. And most of these thinkers and authors were, of course, like the members of these organizations, men. But women also played a role in this story. Among such women was Pennsylvanian Susan Wright, who raised the silkworms used to make this prize-winning silk that you see in the next image, which is nowhere near the quality of a Garthwaite silk, and that is because it is what Americans called homespun. And during the era of the American Revolution, when Americans boycotted London silks, among other things, Americans were more eager than ever to produce silk just like this. And this is when silk takes an interesting political turn for American revolutionaries, like the daughter of Benjamin Franklin, Sally Franklin Bache, who you see in the next image. Now, in 1779, Sally Franklin Bache wrote to her father, who was in France, working on the aftermath of the alliance of the French and Americans in the Revolution. And she wrote to him asking him to send her some lace feathers and other little things to wear to social events that were being held to celebrate the end of British occupation in Philadelphia. Now, Benjamin Franklin wrote back curtly and admonished her to cease asking him for such fripperies and instead to concentrate on her spinning. Now, Bache had a very dutiful but somewhat hurt response and said, "How could my dear papa give me so severe a reprimand for wishing for a little finery?" And she sent her father a very clever reply to his admonishment that she spin rather than seek luxurious fineries. And it was a physical reply. She sent him homespun in the form of a gift of 22 yards of Pennsylvania homespun silk that would have looked like the silk you just saw on the previous slide. But it was meant for Queen Marie Antoinette. And in the next image, try to picture Queen Marie Antoinette wearing that yellow silk that you saw before. So Benjamin Franklin, in reply, chided her again and said, "I don't know how having scarce shoes to your feet, it would come into your head to give silk to a queen. But since you've been a good girl and continue to knit and spin your family stockings, I will send you some things to wear to the ball with George Washington." So perhaps Franklin, although he didn't admit it to her, admitted to himself that contrary to his dismissive comments, in historical context, his daughter's gift made a lot of political sense. Her gift of American-made silk was one that sent a political message that American allegiance had shifted from Britain to France. This was because Franklin himself, in 1772, had given that Pennsylvania yellow silk that I showed you before as a gift to George III's Queen Charlotte. So Sally's just doing the same thing that her father had done, but showing the shifting political allegiances. So another American who gifted American silk to English royalty was South Carolina colonist Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who actually grew this silk made into this dress. You see the front and the back of the same dress here in South Carolina. And she's most famous for indigo experiments, just like Franklin's most famous for his electrical experiments, but both of them also engaged in silk production. And Pinckney, as she confessed, loved the vegetable world extremely. And so one of the things that she experimented with in her love for the vegetable world was growing mulberry trees and raising silkworms. And in 1753, she brought some of her Carolina silk to Spitalfields, where she hired weavers, like those who made Garthwaite's patterns into fabric, to turn the raw silk into fabric. And here you can see one of the final products. And one length that she gave, not this one, because the one on the left is the one that survives in an American collection, but she did give gifts of her South Carolina silk to Augusta, the Dowager Princess of Wales, who herself was an avid botanist. You see Augusta on the right there, the mother of George III. And when Pinckney gave her silk to the princess, she emphasized its exoticism because she also gave her some birds native to South Carolina. And in London, the South Carolina silk was less an economic commodity than it was a symbol of the exoticness of the North American colonies. Pinckney's silk, made by harvesting North American mulberry trees to feed South Carolina silkworms, made it, despite its English appearance, an exotic curiosity in England. And what's interesting about this is that Augusta considered not just the Pinckney silk, but the Pinckneys themselves to be curious specimens. When the princess met the Pinckneys, she commented on her surprise at Eliza's then 7-year-old daughter Harriet's white complexion, given that she'd been nursed by a Black woman. Much like the South Carolina silk, Augusta viewed Harriet with her Black nurse and white skin as likely to be only superficially English. Now, today we see Augusta's notion as silly and baseless, of course, as well as racist, but it serves to remind us of a reality about beautiful things like flowered silk. Because the Pinckney's women experience recalls other histories hidden within seemingly beautiful things like portraits and silk. In this case, the Pinckney silk making relied upon enslaved labor. Silk making was part of their plantation economies. Enslaved children fed the silkworms while slave women reeled the raw silk. Making silk, as even my brief explanation, I'm sure, clued you in, could be tedious, messy, and above all, smelly. And despite their keen fascination, the Pinckney ladies were not the ones cleaning fecal matter from these silkworms' cages or going to gather mulberry leaves at sunrise. Their enslaved workers were. In other words, there are dark labor histories hidden within these luxurious commodities. And yet these histories, embedded though they undoubtedly are, often remained and still remain hidden within the refined beauty of silk or the pleasing aesthetics of a carefully shaped landscape. And in part, this is deliberate on the part of their makers and users. For example, if you think about Eliza Pinckney going to visit a Carolina plantation called Crowfield, she waxes poetic in a letter to a friend about what she calls, quote, the fine prospect of water from the house. And in the next image, you'll see what that would have looked like. Created by a series of fish ponds, canal-like waterways that stretched out into, as she put it, smiling fields dressed in vivid green where Roman goddesses Ceres and Pomona dance. But when Eliza viewed this fine prospect created by the canals, what she really looked upon was an irrigation system for rice fields. So she described these as smiling fields dressed in vivid green, filled with cavorting deities. But in fact, what she was looking at was irrigation systems for rice fields and enslaved people rather than Roman goddesses dancing in them. So she knew what she looked at were rice fields. She oversaw agricultural operations at a number of plantations. Yet when she viewed Crowfield, she chose to look past the realities of its slave production and instead celebrate it for its landscape aesthetics. And I think in much the same way, we've inherited this tendency to look at beautiful things like a lustrous piece of silk or a refined portrait without thinking of what at times troubling histories might be hidden within them. And so the last example I want to give you is just to look at one of the histories embedded within this portrait of a woman wearing Garthwaite designed silk. In the 1746 portrait, Anne Shippen Willing wears a dress designed by Garthwaite in 1743. Within 3 years of the fabric's creation, it had made its way across the Atlantic to America and been sewn into the dress she wears in her portrait by Robert Feek. And I had to include the self-portrait of Robert Feek, and I think you'll see why, because there's a reason he's my 18th century boyfriend. So Robert Feek's portrait of her hangs today at the Winterthur Museum and also was copied, as you'll see in the next image, at least one time, and hangs at a historic house in Philadelphia as well. And in part, this was because she was a mother of 11. She gave birth regularly every few years. Astoundingly, 10 of her 11 children survived to adulthood, and she was one of Philadelphia's great matriarchs. So copies of the portrait were made to give to her many progeny. One comment I would like to make about the difference between the 18th and the 19th century is that the portrait on the right is a 19th century copy, and you will see that the 19th century artist felt necessary to give the 18th century portrait a breast reduction. So if that doesn't sum up some of the differences between the 18th and 19th century, I'm not sure what else does. So what you see though in this portrait and its copies is more than just a portrait of an elite matriarch who is socially, economically, and politically powerful and connected to socially, economically, and politically powerful families. One of these meanings is, if you go to the next slide and jump to the next one, is what her husband did. And her husband is in the portrait on the right. He was a merchant. He also was the mayor of Philadelphia. And finally, he was consistently Philadelphia's most active slave trader. Because, of course, in the mid-18th century, slavery was alive and kicking in Philadelphia, as well as in places like South Carolina. And originally, her portrait was commissioned to hang on the wall of the townhouse that was built the same year that the portrait was done. And it was meant to be really an advertisement for his mercantile trade. She's wearing exactly the damask that he imported, the lace that he imported, the types of fans that he imported. And she's wearing one of the most popular colors that colonists requested, a color imaginatively called cloth, which to our modern eyes would read as khaki. And one of the reasons colonists requested cloth so much was because it was like a pair of khaki pants. You could wear pretty much anything with it. So you could sub out the color of the ribbons or put different accessories with it, and it would take on a different look. So it was very practical, as well as somewhat dirt impervious silk. But important to remember that in addition to lace and silk and pretty things, of course, Charles Willing sold enslaved people. So not only was the house in which this portrait hung maintained by enslaved people, we know they had at least 3, a man, a woman, and a young boy, who was named after the town where Charles Willing's mother was from, living in the house, but they also physically had enslaved people who were waiting to be sold in the front room of the house, which in the Willings case served sometimes as a sort of slave pen as well as place where he would meet his clientele. So that's one dark history hidden within the seemingly lovely story of an elite woman wearing an English imported silk. The last thing I'd like to look at is another story hidden within this portrait. Another portrait of a woman wearing Garthwaite designed flowered silk. And that's the woman in the next image. This is Mary Gray Newland Shippen, the second wife of Anne Shippen Willing's brother. And she, of course, looks familiar to you because she's a near replica of Feke's portrait of her sister-in-law, as you can tell. Now, Feke didn't paint Mary Shippen's portrait. My 18th century boyfriend was not as unskilled as the artist on the right, I will say. But the figures are nearly identical. And the reason that we know it's not just a copy, though, is that if you look at where the folds of the dress are, this is one benefit of doing these things online, you can see them pretty well. It's obvious that they drape in different places. In other words, Anne did not just give Mary permission to copy her portrait, she also gave her the dress to wear. So a really personal gift with a lot of meaning to emphasize the women's personal connections. And so it could be argued that their husbands wanted this to happen, but I don't think this was the case because I think the women are making the aesthetic choices. Anne Shippen Willing herself, the woman on the left, has a number of portraits done later in life. In the next slide, you see two of them, one from 1772 and one from 1786. And she wears flowered silk in all of these, which is unusual because her three portraits that I've shown you are by Feke, by Charles Wilson Peele, and by Matthew Pratt. And if you look at the next slide, and those are all Feke portraits, and then the following slide, which are all Peele portraits, and then the following slide, which are all Pratt portraits, you'll see that those three artists hardly ever paint women wearing patterned silk. It's usually this straight color, shiny, because it's easier to paint and it's harder to date in terms of making you look outmoded in your portrait. So in other words, the women were making this choice. And why does the question of whose choice it was matter? And I think it has to do with the historical context of the copycat portrait. So Edward Shippen married Mary Gray Newland in 1747, the same year this portrait was likely painted. Her first husband had gone to Barbados years before, and he'd just disappeared, so everyone assumed he was dead. But soon after Edward and Mary got married, word came from Barbados that her first husband was, contrary to assumption, very much alive. And obviously this became a huge matter of gossip. The couple agreed to live in separate beds and even for her to go live with her parents until that person at Barbados should really be gone. But they still faced legal pressure. Luckily, though, the governor of Pennsylvania was a relative, and so he pardoned them and saved them from punishment. And the scandal eventually dissolved when a Barbados business contact of the family wrote that he had at last, the first husband, conveniently died in Barbados. But the point is that a marriage celebrated, then dragged into unwitting scandal of bigamy, forms the historical context for Mary Shippen's copycat portrait and the gift of the dress. In other words, the portrait, like the dress, did more than show her likeness or her elite status and gentility. The whole package advertised her standing as a member of two powerfully important colonial families, the Willings as well as the Shippens. In her world, it was more important to visually quote her sister-in-law than it was to look like a fashionable English lady. So even though by the time she's wearing this silk, it would have been seen as a bit outdated, at least 4 to 5 years old by this point, the local context was more important than a metropolitan fashion one. In this case, the flowered silk, the botanicals, are a mechanism for announcing family ties and reasserting dynastic power in the face of scandal. So in looking at how women like Garthwaite and Pinckney and Willing and Shippen made and also wore silk, used silk, you can see the rich, multi-layered, often transatlantic, and always global histories that are embedded in these objects. Whether it's women's labor histories or fashionable gifts that reveal family secrets, or women's roles in global botanical networks or histories of slavery, these objects convey much more complexity than what immediately meets the eye. And if we choose to look deeper, we can find fascinating stories hidden within beautiful things, like a portrait of a woman in silk. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Love your detective work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounded like
and
you
I was going to say the same thing. I'm really amazed by how you were able to look at this portrait and trace back where the silk design came from. What came first in that respect, if I can ask? Like, were you studying Garthwaite first and noticed this portrait of Anne Shippen Willing, or was it the other way around?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I think a chance for me to do something that I think all scholars need to take time to do, which is thank the curators and archivists who make our jobs possible, right? Because of course, it was someone at the Victoria and Albert Museum who decided to collect and then maintained and cataloged Garthwaite's silk designs, which allowed me to get at those 800 designs, including the one that the silk in the portrait's based on. And it was actually the work of a curator who had years ago been trying to track down still surviving Garthwaite silks, who had identified that design matched that portrait. However, I knew none of this when I stumbled into this project because I'm not a curator, right? I was trying to come up with a transatlantic history project, and I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I was looking at surviving silks from Garthwaite, because originally I was thinking of doing something like comparative material culture of Huguenots, right? And she worked with a lot of Huguenots. And I kept looking at the textiles and thinking, these really remind me of this portrait that's back at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. And I wonder if that's coincidence. And the reason that the portrait stuck in my mind is that, graduate students, we always made fun of, her very enormous bosom, which came by honestly, right? She had 11 children. And in fact, she likely was pregnant when that portrait was painted. So there's some interesting maternity clothes sidebars I could make. But did some digging and discovered that, yes, my visual memory was right. And that not only was that the design, but that Anna Maria Garthwaite, who is really wonderfully organized, labels all of her designs. She dates them. She writes who commissioned them, as well as naming them based on their botanicals. And then I figured out that the silk weaver himself, Simon Julens, who's a Huguenot, could be traced. And then Robert Feek, definitely, he loved this portrait. It's one of the few that he signed. So I was thinking that is so unusual because most colonial American portraits, something like, portrait of an unidentified woman, much less, the sitter, the artist, and you never identify the designer and the maker of the silk. So it was a really fabulous chance to combine these lives that together coalesce in the making of this object, right? And one of the things that was amazing about these people is that every single one of them are the types of people who, if we just look at written records, kind of fall through the archive.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but it's kind of through objects and thinking about what objects can do for telling us about the past, that and giving us an alternate history that sometimes is lost, that we really get to some of these otherwise hidden histories, right?
Zara, how did her designs come to be saved? Because that seems to me like another miracle.
Absolutely. And that is a little fuzzy. So her cutwork design, for example, the one that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum that I started off the talk with, that was saved by Garthwaite herself had no children. Her sister had no children. Her other sister had no children, and their ward, Mary, died at a pretty young age. But so a lot of the Garthwaite stuff was saved by one of their nephews who was a baronet. So he had, money. And that cutwork piece was saved in the Garthwaite family for decades and decades, and eventually made its way, carefully framed, eventually made its way into the Victoria and Albert Museum. I'm not sure if the family also had the designs, because I think what happened with the designs is that a 19th century British textile design firm had them, because some of them were, and I'm not sure if they were sold to them or if they came to them through some roundabout, she'd given them to some other silk designer and then they made their way. Because in the 19th century, of course, the British silk industry in London really declines precipitously. And it, partly because the jacquard loom comes into being, and technologically speaking, they can't keep up. So story of extreme poverty. And then the weaving is sort of outsourced into places like the British Midlands, like Manchester and Byron. The reason I think that the designs in most cases went directly to another firm who use them to, create new designs, is that there's also something called Garthwaite paper that comes into being in the 19th century, and it's a certain type of gridded paper that you use for making textile designs. So I think she really did have this sort of technological manufacturing afterlife. One of the things that I can't in any way, shape, or form prove, but I think that William Morris must have seen some of these designs at some point. So fascinating to think about, how all of these designs are circulating around London and influencing other designs in the future.
Fascinating. You mentioned the Huguenot quite often, and I'm used to, I think, from a slightly later period, associating France with silk and England more with the cottons, and having with an eye to that dispute, but the later dispute. Can you say a little bit more about the association between France and silks, and
Yes.
why the Huguenot?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. Silk is a matter of real national rivalry between England and France. England is constantly trying to say that it can design and make silk as good as France can, and pretty much everyone, including most English people themselves in the industry, know that that's not true. So French silk is always the sort of, gold standard of silk in the 18th century in particular. And French silk designs and weaving techniques are carefully guarded secrets. There are acts against sharing them outside of the borders of France.
Still.
Yeah, I don't know if there still are, but there
Oh.
definitely were in the 18th and 19th century. And I mentioned that Garthwaite had some of those French designs. That was illegal to have those because normally they would have been seized by, an early iteration of what we would think of as customs, right? And sort of kept embargoed. But so the British are constantly trying to get to understand French design techniques. And one of the reasons the Huguenots are so important is after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had given them religious freedom, they face religious persecution. And so they flee to Protestant countries in Europe, including England. And so they become, of course, they bring their trade secrets with them, right? And so they become the real elite of the London silk weaving industry, definitely when it comes to silk design too. So that's another reason that Garthwaite's unusual, because she is English, and most of the guys, and they're almost all guys, is that they are French Huguenot descent. And at a certain point, they're never even the majority, but it's just that thing where it's the sort of prestige factor, right? It's like, oh, well, we know French silk is better, so the French designer must be better, even though it's arguable whether or not they actually are. But yeah, complete political rivalry. I mean, Parliament spends a lot of time talking about French silk and how it should be embargoed.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions coming in from our audience. So can you tell us if, you showed us a lot of pictures today, where some of these garments might be located and how they're maybe identified as belonging to Garthwaite or another designer?
Yeah, so some of the dresses that I showed you that aren't in portraits, right, that are actual dresses, are Garthwaite designs. And the one that was the sort of cream background with the multicolored flower, naturalistic flowers, that is at the museum of, I think it's called the Museum of History, that's in Albany, New York. And the MFA in Boston has a lot of them, including the blue one that I showed you. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is where the fabulous men's waistcoat with, the gold thread and the wonderfully colorful design is. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has some, the Museum of the City of New York. They really are, the Victoria and Albert Museum, of course. They really are scattered all over the place, which is evidence of the fact that, they really did make it around to not just North America, but Scandinavia and other places. So she really is scattered around various museum collections. So it's a testament to how much she designed and the quality of the stuff that it was saved. And often the histories attached to these garments are that they are cherished and passed down through generations. And that the beer dress, as I think of it, is not a Garthwaite design, but is very similar to her botanically natural designs, of course. And that is at the Museum of London. And that is an amazing survival because oftentimes silk like that was filled with metallic thread would, when it went out of fashion, be burned so the metallic thread could be retrieved and you would be left with the silk and gold. So it's kind of amazing that that survived. And I'm sure it's because of its political associations, among other things.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, we have an interesting question here. Were her flower designs, for the most part, botanical studies? Those are the ones you've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Or did she have other sources of inspiration, such as the language of flowers and that sort of thing?
Yeah, the language of flowers is such a great question because, of course, in the 18th century, not just types of flowers, but colors of flowers conveyed messages, right? You could tell someone whether you wanted to just be friends or pursue a romantic relationship, depending on what color rose you gave them, right? So she is undoubtedly tapping into that cultural knowledge of the language of flowers. And I did not do this, but it would be fascinating to go and look at how some of her flowers are speaking to one another, right? It was suggested to me by Joyce Chaplin, who's a historian, that the aloe and the rose might be meant to symbolize a sort of alchemical combination of beauty and medicinal purposes. And I think that that's a wonderful suggestion. So, I think that there's a lot there because certainly she's not the only one who would have been conversant in the language of flowers.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So a question that came to my mind as well, a subscriber to Spoonflower that I am, I was wondering, since so many patterns exist, are they being used in reproduction?
Okay, well, I actually have a visual aid. This this is a Garthwaite pattern. That's been made into, and it's interesting because, of course, it's not woven. It is a cotton fabric. And I have this next to my desk because I've been meaning forever to make it into pillows that will, anyway, but it's not the time. I'm a much better historical detective than I am a craftsman. So that hasn't happened yet. But yes, you can buy reproductions. And in this case, it's really interesting because, of course, her textiles themselves are all woven. And so they have this multidimensionality. And one of the ways she achieves that naturalistic effect is floating webs and wharfs. So different layers so if you ran your finger over it, you would actually feel a sort of three-dimensionality. But the repros are just printed on cotton for the most part. Although I will say I did have a wonderfully named and wonderful woman, Rabbit Goody, who operates a historic textile production business in New England, sent me a reproduction piece of Garthwaite damask that she wove into wool because she got my book and enjoyed it. And I was like, wow, what an amazing gift. So it's really, there are definitely weavers, contemporary weavers who are out there making reproductions of her stuff too. So it's really kind of cool how it continues on in this influential way.
Did you say
one thing
that?
I was going to say, they're very classic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you say we don't know where she got the knowledge to be able to design in this way and to understand the math, but also the mechanics of weaving?
Yeah, we really don't. So it is, my personal thought, and I just had no evidence for this. So there are limits to how much you can speculate, right? Like I'm comfortable with some speculation, but other speculation, you're like, I have a hunch that's not going to work out. But I do have a hunch that her connection to Vincent Bacon. So Vincent Bacon was not only connected to all of these scientific networks and the botanical gardens, he himself also lived in Spitalfields. So, and some of his clients to whom he administered his apothecary remedies, like a man who thought he was eating dandelions, but it was actually wolfsbane. And he had to go and get him, help him out, was a weaver in Spitalfields. So I think personally that Garthwaite Bacon was her intro into the world of Spitalfields weavers. And I think that she struck up some friendships because there are people she works with again and again. And she just sort of figured out how to do it, because the design I showed you of the really elementary looking red and green tree, that was done in York before they moved to London. And I think for that, she was already thinking about trying to design, but that it's not on gridded paper. It's not got the same mathematical thing going on. I think that was meant to be an embroidery design. And then I think when she got to London, because of the connection with the Bacons in Spitalfield and their knowledge of people in the weaving community, that she got into it that way. But it is completely improbable, because, it'd be like one of the, younger daughters of a Jane Austen novel who's a clergyman's daughter, like hiving off to London and starting, scientifically based designing, right? Like it'd be really, she was supposed to marry another clergyman and settle down and have, clergyman babies. And instead she created this other life in London, and created it when she was in her 40s, right? So it's this really amazing story of a woman who's not really following the life path that she was supposed to.
I'm trying to imagine these clergyman babies personally. On that note, we have perhaps our last question, since we're out of time.
Well, I mean, Robert Feek, he's a mistake. Sadly, he got no time in this talk, but he's a wonderfully mysterious artist. We don't even know if he died in Bermuda or Barbados. He just sort of disappears in the Atlantic. But he's just this wonderful man who is raised a Baptist, marries a Quaker woman, but stays a Baptist, and paints in Philadelphia. One of his first paintings is sent to him courtesy of a Jewish merchant in New York. He really personifies this he lived in Newport, Rhode Island. He really personifies this like vibrant, religiously inclusive community of Newport, Rhode Island. And I think that he's just fascinating in terms of how he creates himself too. So he's a mariner, a sailor, who turns into an artist. And he also is largely self-taught.
How do you spell his name?
Feek, F-E-K-E. Okay. First name Robert. And the reason he's my boyfriend is, in addition to being fascinating, he's just, look at that dashing self-portrait. How can you not?
Oh, thank you so much. This was a delight.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was really fabulous. And thank you all for the questions.
I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but clearly everyone enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you to Zara. Hold on, everyone, because we have just a few announcements coming up from the Jane Austen Summer Program and Jane Austen and Company. Next up is on May 9th, we're talking about sea bathing, everybody's favorite cure for all of your ailments. And we're going to be exploring the use of sea bathing as it was practiced during Jane Austen's time, as well as in her novels. So that's going to be a fascinating talk. And then our last talk of the year will be on May 23rd, at least last talk of the season, before we go on our summer hiatus, is going to be the questionable comforts of home cures with Julian Guerre. This is going to be back-to-back about some medical cures. So if you're interested in the history of science, be sure to sign up at our website, janeaustenandco.org/sign up.
And registration for the Jane Austen Summer Program 2023, Austen's Teenage Writings, is still open. This year, our theme is Austen's Teenage Writings, all that juvenilia. So join us in Chapel Hill for a weekend of balls, workshops, discussion groups, and other exciting activities. Among the plenary speakers will be Katie Childs and Kamiyo Ogawa, who you know from other episodes of Jane Austen and Company, Juliet McMaster, who is a critic, editor, and illustrator of Jane Austen's juvenilia, among lots of other things. Maria Grace, who is the author of the Jane Austen's Dragons fantasy series. Sayantani Dasgupta, who's a physician and young adult novelist, also focusing on Austen adaptation. And Whit Stillman, the director of Jane Austen in Manhattan and Love and Friendship. So we would really love to see you there.
Great. And there's also a sale on right now for a percentage off, maybe 20% for first-time JASP attendees too.
Oh, wow.
This program was supported in part by North Carolina Humanities, an affiliate of the National Endowment of Humanities. And we would like to thank the UNC's Humanities for the Public Good project of the College of Arts and Sciences with support from the Mellon Foundation. And of course, we thank you for your donations, which really mean a lot.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful time, and we'll see you again in May.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Zara.
Wonderful talk.